I'm Johnny Burtka, the president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and it's a privilege to join you for what promises to be a thoughtful and broad-ranging conversation. I'd especially like to give a special welcome tonight to our students, faculty, alumni, and supporters who have partnered with us to pursue our mission of educating for liberty. Your friendship has been essential to allowing us to build the educational programs and network needed to produce some of America's most impactful leaders, from Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito to Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn to entrepreneur and investor Peter Thiel. For that, I am very grateful to you, and I'm excited to offer this special program tonight as a way for you to help us engage in the battle of ideas. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight, Rod. I'm also joined by my colleague, ISI's Academic Program Officer, James Davenport, to interview my dear friend, Rod Dreher, about his new New York Times best-selling book, Live Not by Lies, a Manual for Christian Dissidents. And James has put a link to the book in the chat on the right side of the screen. So I would encourage all of you to go out and order a copy tonight. As many of you know, Rod Dreher is a senior editor at the American Conservative. He has written and edited for the New York Post, the Dallas Morning News, National Review, and his commentary has been published in the Wall Street Journal and the Weekly Standard. He is the best-selling author of The Benedict Option, for which he won ISI's prestigious Conservative Book of the Year award, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, Crunchy Cons, and How Dante Can Save Your Life. Thanks for joining us tonight, Rod.
Welcome. And I'm here with Dante as well.
All right. That's awesome.
That's great. Well, Rod, we'd love to kick it off with if you could just summarize the core argument of the book for us, of Live Not by Lies for us, and sort of tell us why it's different than the case you make in the Benedict Option.
Right. Well, 5 years ago, I got a call from a doctor whose mother had lived in Czechoslovakia, born and raised in Czechoslovakia, and had spent 4 or 5 years in a Czech prison for her Catholic faith back in the 1950s. And he said that his mother, who's elderly now, lived with him and his wife here in the U.S., that she'd started to see things happening in America that reminded her of what she left behind. That seemed alarmist to me, but over the next few years, as I would travel around to conferences or to give speeches, and I would meet people who had grown up under communism, I would ask them, are you starting to see things here that, remind you of the old country? And they all would say yes, often emphatically. And if you would talk to them long enough, they would talk about how angry they were that Americans weren't taking them seriously. So the argument of our book is twofold. One, that what we're experiencing here in the West and in the U.S. in particular is an emerging form of totalitarianism that I call soft totalitarianism. It will not be Stalinism 2.0. If we think that that's what totalitarianism is only, then we're going to miss what's going on. Rather, totalitarianism is a totalitarian society is one in which everything becomes politicized. And it is quite possible to have a totalitarian society within a liberal democracy. And I think that's what we're seeing emerge here. It's not coming only from the government, but also from institutions in society like universities, the media, even corporations. So the first part of the book is about waking people up to what's happening, to the nature of the threat. The second half of the book is based on a number of interviews I did in Russia, in some of the former Soviet bloc countries, with Christian dissidents mostly, who stood up to hard totalitarianism and who offer certain advice for us, for we in America, for how we can not only recognize what's coming, but stand against it. And the title of the book comes from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's 1974 short communique he wrote to his followers in Russia just before the Soviets kicked him out. And in it, he said, essentially, look, we can't hope to overturn this government, but one thing we can do is deprive them of the presumption of our consent. Whenever we hear any lies being spoken publicly, we have an obligation to stand up and walk out, or refuse to say things that we don't believe just for the sake of going along to get along. So live not by lies was good advice for the Russians in the late Soviet period, and it is good advice for us.
And Rod, what do you think are the cultural conditions that make soft totalitarianism possible? And do you see those in America today?
Johnny, it was so fascinating to me and deeply worrying to read Hannah Arendt's her first book, one of her great books, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She wrote that as a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. She wrote it after the war was over to try to understand what it was about the social conditions in Germany and in Russia that caused both of those countries to surrender to totalitarianism. And she identified a number of things that they had in common, things that we also see here in contemporary America. The first and most important by far condition was mass loneliness and alienation. This is the fundamental condition that make people susceptible to totalitarianism, when people feel no longer connected to each other, to the institutions in their society, or to anything any traditional idea or way of life that gave their lives meaning and purpose and a sense of solidarity. That's when they open themselves up to this political pseudo-religions. She also saw, Arendt, that a society in which people wish to transgress and destroy simply for the sake of transgressing and destroying. She talked about elites who, in the pre-totalitarian societies, elites who were prepared to tear down the fundamental pillars of civilization and of liberal democracy for the sake of allowing those who had been excluded to rush in. She talked about a society or societies in which people cease to believe in truth. That is, they no longer seek the truth, but they want instead to believe things that fit their own prejudices. And they're aware of doing this and don't care anymore. These and other things, there's a few others, but those are the main ones that make a society susceptible to believing in its political ideologies and make it harder for us to defend ourselves against them. I think that primarily what we're seeing here in this country, of course, is this is coming from the left. But it is also the case, and this has been somewhat dismaying to me as a conservative, to see some people on the right also seeming to not care about objective truth, but rather only to care about facts and logic that make us, that satisfy our prejudices and would appear to open the door for us to gain power.
And one follow-up to that, I mean, do you think American society is really more politicized today than earlier in our history? Because if you go back and, listen to any biography of the founding fathers, you hear about the vitriol, between the Federalists and the Republicans, and the newspaper articles that were written were just, absolutely, it was egregious. It was unbelievable, even by today's standards from what you see on Twitter. So are we worse off now than we were then?
Well, I mean, there was never any golden age of American democracy where we all came together and held hands and said kumbaya together. But I think what's so interesting about conditions today is that we really do seem to have absorbed the 1960s slogan, "The personal is political." I can remember, I'm 53 years old. I grew up as I was a kid in the 70s, and people just didn't talk about politics in the way they do today. People, you had, I'm from Louisiana. People could be passionate about politics, but it didn't seem to set the dividing lines between families and within families and among friends in the way it does today. I think today that people have come to believe in politics as almost a personal brand in a way that people used to believe in religion. And I think it's also the case that, and this is Alistair McIntyre's point in After Virtue, that we in the contemporary West have lost the ability to reason together. We don't agree on certain fundamental things that would allow us to test our claims against reason and against fundamental claims that we all agree on, and resolve our differences. Because of that, he said that our politics just simply becomes a matter of emotivism, of satisfying emotional exhortations, and things become more and more heated because there's no way to settle things. And I think that's absolutely true today. I mean, it's really remarkable to me to see just over the course of my life how radical things have become. I gave a speech about a month ago at a state university here in Louisiana, Nichols State, down on the bayou, on Bayou Lafourche. This is Ed Ogeron territory. This is pretty conservative. But at the school, just before I came there, the college Republicans had been placed under terrible fire for simply chalking MAGA 2020, vote Trump, on the sidewalk. The social justice warriors at this small state university in this deep red state went berserk. They had a 3-hour student government meeting, and the head of the college Republicans and his girlfriend had to be escorted to class by campus police because they had had so many death threats. Now, I was in college at State University here in Louisiana in the 1980s. I was on the left, more or less, back then, and it never would have occurred to any of us on the left or the right to appeal to university authority to shut down our opponents, much less make death threats against people who disagreed with us. I think that is a real and dramatic change that we've seen just in my lifetime.
One thing I'd love to ask as well, Rod, is one of the sort of manifestations of woke totalitarianism that you bring up in the book is woke capitalism. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about what exactly you mean by that and how it's a threat.
Yeah. You know, this is, I think, one of the biggest conceptual barriers to people on the right, especially people my generation and older, understanding the nature of the threat. We older conservatives grew up in a world that was his framework was set by the Cold War and by statism. In the fusionism that came out of 1950s, from the right of the 1950s, the people who were the libertarians and the more traditional conservatives were able to agree that the real enemy was the Leviathan state, that and of course the Soviet Union. And what we've gotten to now is a condition in which big business, which a lot of us on the right previously looked to as being a bulwark against the Leviathan state, it has actually flipped. And traditional conservatives might have said a long time ago and did say that big business isn't necessarily the friend of conservatism, but popular conservatism, certainly since the Reagan era, has seen big business as the good guys. Everything changed decisively in 2015. That was when the state of Indiana passed the state version of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the federal law that would have guaranteed for religious people, it would have given them an affirmative defense in law if they were ever charged criminally or or sued for discrimination. They could have, or for whatever they had done, if they could say that, I was exercising my religious liberty. It wouldn't guarantee that they win, but it would give them a defense. Anyway, the state of Indiana passed a state version of this bipartisan federal law. Big business came down like a ton of bricks on Indiana after Governor Mike Pence signed this legislation. Apple, Salesforce, many other of the major corporations told Indiana that this is bigoted legislation. They perceived it as anti-LGBT. So it's bigoted legislation, and if you don't repeal it, there will be severe economic consequences. I think it took about a week for the state to back down. After Indiana backed down, in Arkansas, some similar legislation had been proposed. Walmart cleared its throat, and boom, the legislation went away. That was the first time that big business had ever taken sides in quite that way in the culture war. And since then, it has been without question, big business has been on the side of social liberalism and progressivism. I see that, in the workplace, I hear all the time from people who write me about what's going on in their companies, about how they are being compelled to participate in things that violate their conscience, usually having to do with LGBT rights. But there's also a lot of racial propagandizing that's going on within these companies. President Trump signed an executive order not long ago prohibiting that. Biden's going to reverse it. I think, though, that the thing people need to understand is that government itself is not the only threat to our liberties, our religious liberty and free speech. It's coming from major corporations, and they have a lot of freedom in this way to shape the conversation and to repress and oppress people who disagree. I think that this is something that we don't really know quite how to deal with, certainly not on the right or in general in our society today. Finally, I should say that Shoshana Zuboff, the former Harvard Business School professor, she's written about what she calls surveillance capitalism. And this is we can talk about that maybe in a bit. It's the economic model that Google pioneered and that others like Facebook, Amazon have taken up, where they hoover in data from our smartphones, from our use of the internet. And anytime we interact with the internet, we generate data about ourselves. Big companies take all this and they get it perfectly legally, and they use it, they run it through algorithms to develop profiles of each of us. Now, when you have this kind of data being taken legally by corporations, and you combine it with corporations who feel that they have a responsibility to suppress hatred and suppress extremism in this country, you can see that this is going to a really bad place.
So, Rod, sort of in this, the era of surveillance capitalism and woke capitalism, is there any hope for types of businesses or industry that could actually promote human flourishing, promote the flourishing of families and communities, the values we hold dear as conservatives? What would you see that looking like, sort of an economics or business working for the common good?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's nothing forcing companies to do this. It's incredible how fast they collapse, though, in the face of woke pressure. And I think what's happening is I don't think there's necessarily a wide public mandate demanding companies get woke. I think it's coming rather from the professional class and the elite class, from the peers of people who run these companies, who feel like this is the thing they have to do in order to seem progressive and au courant and on the right side of history. But I think that companies that refuse to do this, refuse to join the bandwagon, I hope that they will, at some point, we will reward them for doing so. I think there's some company, I can't think of the name of it, but there's some tech company that said, you know what, we're just going to focus on work. We're not going to bring politics into our company. If you don't like it, go work somewhere else. I wish I could think of the name of them. Maybe one of the listeners knows, but I think that could be a good sign. Plus, small business does not have to thrive under these regulations, and so that could be a source of resistance. But I think that one thing I hope that Republican lawmakers will do, whether Biden is the president or later we have a Republican president, is pass legislation that will protect companies as much as possible from this kind of extreme pressure. I'm not quite sure what that looks like yet, but I'm encouraged when I see people like Senator Josh Hawley, who seems to understand that big business and the rules that big business works under or is operating under actually works against liberty.
One more follow-up question to that. I mean, do you think this is actually sort of corporations sort of adopting the woke mentality? Is that good for business? Does it help the bottom line, or are they valuing other things like their social capital more than profits?
Well, in Live Not by Lies, I quote one analyst, I think it's Larry Fink at BlackRock, saying that increasingly among millennials and Gen Z folks, consumers want companies to be aligned with the proper social values, meaning progressive social values. So, I think that we can't ignore that there's a very loud and determined aspect among younger generations that want that. But I think, we don't almost knocked my light over here. Sorry. I don't think that we've seen yet any serious pushback from corporations to wokeness. So I don't think we have any real data points that would tell us, will there be a reward for standing up to this bullying? And companies, especially during COVID, everybody's bottom line is so fragile right now that I don't think companies want to necessarily take those risks. But I really would like to see it happen, because part of me thinks it's really a paper tiger. I can remember back in the early 2000s, I was writing at the New York Post about the work that Jesse Jackson was doing as a civil rights activist to get corporations to give money to his various charities. And what he was doing was a de facto blackmail, threatening, like, if you don't want us to harass you and call you racist, you want to donate to the Wall Street Project, or whatever he was calling it. There was a guy, the head of Cypress Semiconductor, I forget his name now, but he told Jesse Jackson to go jump in a lake. He goes, I'm not going to be shaken down by you. Jackson fulminated and said, this is crazy. You will pay. Nothing happened. And this guy was the CEO was a real kind of a hero of mine, because he was the only one in big business and major corporations to have the guts to stand up to this shakedown. And guess what? He didn't have to pay a price. I hope that people in big business will find their courage and just standing for fairness, and keeping politicization out of the workplace. That is one aspect of totalitarianism. I mentioned earlier in this talk, the politicizing of everything. In the early Soviet Union, I think it was 1924, the Soviet Chess Society wanted to keep revolutionary politics out of the chess society. The commissar wrote to them and said, no, comrades, in the revolution, there must be no aspect of life that the revolution doesn't touch. You say you want to keep chess for chess's sake, but no, we have to have chess for the sake of the revolution. In the same way, you can see the same logic playing out for social justice across many platforms and in many institutions. It's really dangerous,
especially in sports these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. Who ever thought we were going to see that? Sports was one thing where all Americans could come together and enjoy. The one thing that brought us together to enjoy life and enjoy being with each other. I can remember last year. Gosh, was it last? It seems like last. I think it was earlier this year when LSU, my alma mater, when it won the national championship. I went to watch the game in a sports bar here in Baton Rouge. I was standing next to a working class African-American man. We were shoulder to shoulder, drinking beer, cheering for the Tigers, talking about the game. This was about the only time somebody like me is going to meet somebody like him. And it was wonderful. Now, though, we have to get all woke about sports, and people have to be suspicious of each other about where do you stand on the Tigers, on Black Lives Matter, and so on and so forth. I think it's really bad for the country.
Absolutely. And I wonder if I could sort of point to one of the people that you hold as a model in the book, Father Kolakovic. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about him and how he resisted this Soviet form of totalitarianism, and how we can look up to him and draw inspiration from him.
Oh, I love this man. He's a real unsung hero of the 20th century. His name is Father Tomoslov Kolakovic. And excuse me, I dedicated my book to his memory. He died around 1990. Father Kolakovic was a Jesuit in Croatia, in Zagreb. In the 1940s, he was leading anti-Nazi opposition. When he got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him, or one of the Nazi agents were coming for him, he escaped Croatia and went to hide out in Slovakia, his mother's homeland, and adopted her last name, Kolakovic. He taught in the Catholic University in Bratislava, and he told his students, he said, look, I've got good news for you. The Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is that the Soviets are going to be ruling this country when it's over. He had studied in the Vatican in the Russicum to prepare for missionary work in the Soviet Union. So he knew the Soviet mindset. He told his students that when they take over, the first thing they're going to do is come after the church, and we've got to get ready. So what Father Kolakovic did was organize cells of students who would come together not only to pray, but to study the faith and to study how the faith applied to the changing society around them and to prepare for persecution. They would learn things like how to resist an interrogation, things like that, spycraft, you might say. Very quickly, Father Kolakovic's cells, his network spread across Slovakia, and everybody wanted to be part of it, all the young people. The bishops of Slovakia criticized him, telling him he was being alarmist, things weren't going to get so bad, quit scaring people. But Kolakovic knew that the clericalism, the traditional clericalism of the Slovak Catholic Church was their Achilles heel, and the communists knew that too. So all they had to do was go after the priest and the institutional churches, and they would control the church. That was what Kolakovic was preparing the laity and certain priests for. Sure enough, in 1948, there was a communist putsch, the Iron Curtain fell. The first thing they did was come after the churches. Father Kolakovic's network became the backbone of the underground church, and as such, the only significant anti-communist resistance in that country for the next 40 years. I believe that we are in a Kolakovic moment here in America. I don't know when things are going to turn definitively, but I believe that we cannot afford now to waste our liberty. We have to start organizing now, not just in churches, but among all people who love our liberties, who love free speech, who want to defend freedom of religion, and prepare for a time when we may not be able to exercise them. We have to keep the memory of what it meant to be free alive, and we have to be able to protect each other when we are persecuted. We already saw earlier this year, and this is something so encouraging to me, when at Princeton University, Professor Jonathan Katz, a liberal himself in the classics department, he wrote something objecting to a plan that a lot of professors at Princeton had to make Princeton, quote unquote, anti-racist. And this is just an Orwellian word, meaning they want to discriminate on the basis of race, but do it, and to help the left. Katz objected to it publicly, and he was set upon by this woke mob of other professors at Princeton. It looked like he was going to be a goner, but Professor Robbie George at Princeton and others very quickly organized a group of professors around the country to stand with Katz. And it was Joshua Katz, not Jonathan Katz. And Joshua Katz kept his job, and as far as I know, he's still there. This is a sign of what we have to do. We have to come together, even across political lines. I've been so encouraged, guys, by what has happened with people like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, two liberal atheist academics from Evergreen State who were driven out by the woke mob and who have been awakened to the threat to our basic liberties. They've become friends with people like me. Barry Weiss from the New York Times, secular liberal Jewish woman. She and I were on a Zoom call with Natan Sharansky, the great Soviet Jewish dissident, on Sunday. And Barry Weiss said, if you had told me 2 years ago that I was going to be on the same side as Rod Dreher about anything, I would have laughed. But here we are. Similarly, we on the right, we conservatives have got to realize that there are people on the left that not only can we work with, but we must work with.
Absolutely. One thing I wanted to point out, so you mentioned sort of, being a part of institutions. And one thing in Elizabeth Corey's review of your book in our journal, Modern Age, the task of conservatives, as I understand it, is to encourage individuality and choice within established traditions of life and conduct. Dreher rightly points out that this is difficult and that there are powerful forces within modernity that aim at diluting or eliminating all traditions. But here is the real task for conservatives: to infiltrate institutions or establish new ones, to serve as models for the young in public and private life, to form stable families, to engage in religious life with joy, to question the world's standards of value, and to establish our own alternatives. I see all this taking place right now. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit, and sort of the sense of, are things like this taking place, right? Do we have hope? Are there certain individuals today who we can draw hope from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with her, and this is what I argued for in the Benedict option. I'm sorry you asked earlier about how Live Not by Lies differs from the Benedict option. Let me go back very quickly and answer that question as to answer what you just asked. This Live Not by Lies is basically a successor to the Benedict option. The Benedict option talked more generally about what does it mean to be a faithful Christian in this post-Christian world, and I talk about how we faithful Christians need small Orthodox Christians, which I guess is a better term than conservative, how we need to start forming these small groups and small institutions to be resilient and to discipline ourselves and to root ourselves very deeply in our faith and our traditions so we can be resilient in the face of modernity and attacks from outside. It was not about head for the hills. Live Not by Lies is in the same general track as that, but it tries to be much more precise about the totalitarian nature of what's coming, and to give more specific advice about how to deal with aggressive attacks on religion and tradition. But the two are complementary, I believe. And I think Elizabeth Corey, who's a friend of mine, and she says in the review as well that we're friends, I took her critique to be friendly, and I don't find much to complain about there. I think that the only thing that we can do is exactly what she said. I don't think that this is going to be the sort of a problem, the soft totalitarianism, that can be solved by voting for the correct candidates and getting the right judges on the bench. That's part of it, but mostly it's going to be solved, if it can be solved at all, at the local level, by creating like new classical Christian schools. I'm very excited by the classical Christian school movement, but also by doing things much more precise. I'll give you an example. In Live Not by Lies, I talk about how, and also in Benedict option, I talk about Václav Benda, who the Benda family were the only Christians in the inner circle of Václav Havel and the Charter 77 resistors in the Czech part of Czechoslovakia. So, and Roger Scruton told me that this was a key thing for people to do. Back then, because all the education was completely ideological in the public institutions, the Czechs had to come together to have these private seminars to keep the cultural memory of what it meant to be Czech and what it meant to be part of the Western tradition alive. I think what ISI does is a hugely important part of this. But what we need to do is, more broadly on the right, is to wake people up to the need to do this ourselves. We can't simply sit back and wait for somebody to do it for us. We Americans are so accustomed to having things done for us. We want somebody to come up with the thing that's going to solve our problem without requiring any effort from us. We need to rediscover our own possibilities to do this ourselves. This is one reason, one way that the Czechs and others in Eastern Europe, they kept their memory of who they were alive. I tell a story in the book about Pope John Paul II when he was young. Young Karol Wojtyła was a theater student when the Nazis invaded Poland. And what the Nazis tended to do was to subjugate the Poles by eliminating memory of the Poles as a nation and eliminated the Catholic Church. And what Wojtyła did in his inner circle, they knew that they couldn't take up weapons against the Wehrmacht. It was not possible. What they did was write plays about Polish patriotic themes and also about Catholic themes. And they performed these plays to underground audiences. Everybody who came out knew they were risking their lives in order to do this, but they all had a commitment to remembering who they were. And it was so important that they risked their lives. We have to develop the same sort of commitment today, and not to see education just as something we do to get a good job, but rather as something essential to our identities.
Absolutely. And one question I wanted to ask in relation to education specifically is, we work with a lot of undergraduate students and faculty and graduate students, and they're sort of on the front lines in many ways. One of the things you say in your book is that, you know, campus culture has grown up, right? Campus culture has come, and it's now sort of in the rest of our culture. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how can people in higher ed resist this sort of woke totalitarianism that's all around them?
You know, this is something that's really fascinating to me because I'm not part of that world, but I get these emails from people who are within it, who are really have their backs to the wall, and they don't know what they can do. There's this one guy in particular who said that he feels like, he told me recently that he feels like he has to be suspicious of everybody he passes in the hallway in his college. And this is a major state university and a red state, but he feels like that there are people just lying in wait for him to say the wrong thing so they can report him. I think that people like that, we need to be able to find each other. And we need to, maybe it has to happen off campus, but we have to find some sort of way for people to identify each other and to come together to talk about what's going on and to support each other. Now, I wish I could be more specific than that, but I think that the particular problems may be different on each campus. But we also need to help students know that dissenting students know that they aren't alone. You know, that they're not alone and they're not crazy. One thing that has been really surprising to me is how unaware so many young people are today about our history and about our tradition. I mean, I guess that, you know, the older people have always complained about young people don't know anything today. But in the book, I talk about a conversation I had with a 26-year-old woman, a Californian graduate of a good college, who called herself a communist, you know, and she said, "Isn't it great, the brotherhood of man and all that?" I asked her, "Okay, so what about the Gulag?" She had no idea what I was talking about. And in fact, when I went to the Soviet Union, I talked to a 23-year-old woman. She was a waitress in a luxury hotel bar near the Kremlin, who asked me, "Who was that guy you were talking to?" I was interviewing Alexander Ogorodnikov, a famous dissident. And I said, "That's one of the greatest men in Russia." She said, "What did he do?" I said, "He survived the Gulag and wrote about it." She goes, "Gulag? I think I've heard of that." This is how important it is. I was talking to a Westerner who teaches in Poland at a Polish school. He's a British conservative. And he told me, he said, "You can't imagine how powerful social media is to erase the memory and to control the focus of young people today." You know, so young people don't even know what they're missing in many cases. And I don't think that we're doing them any good when we appeal to their sense of wanting to dissent from wokeness by only channeling that to political activism. You know, I think I don't want to discourage people from being politically active, but we haven't done anything to conserve the Western tradition if all we've done is make them better Republican Party activists, you know?
Yeah.
Rod, just sort of a prudential question for you. I know you mentioned, you know, teaching kids, you know, the principles of the Western heritage, letting them know that they're not alone when they're, you know, on campus and feeling isolated. But sort of, it seems to be, and this is the question that we're getting often over and over again in the chat. And I see you probably get this on I think you probably get this on your blog too, but people want to know, how do they navigate these situations at work and in the classroom very specifically? You know, how do they go about deciding, okay, is this the time that I raise my hand and say, I object to this? Or, you know, are there other times when maybe you just kind of need to keep your head down and get by because you have to take a paycheck home, or, you know, you're aspiring to be a professor in the academy and you don't want to out yourself too early as a conservative in graduate school? How do you navigate? Who do you turn to navigate these dilemmas?
It's really a question of prudence. And people want, from me, often they want like the 5-point checklist of like, this is how you know. And I don't think that's really possible. Like, I've had people, when I was in Poland, I talked to a couple of people, Polish Catholics who work for the Polish branch of Western multinational corporations. And they were being hit with gender ideology and LGBT pride celebrations. And they felt really uncomfortable having to join this as Polish Catholics, but they were also afraid to speak up because they needed those jobs. Now, who am I as an American who just jets in to talk to them and can jet back out? I work at the American Conservative. My job is safe. Who am I to say, yeah, you have an obligation to go stand up and take a stand right here, right now? Maybe they do, but I don't have any skin in their particular game. So I felt really hesitant about saying this is definitely what you should do. So what I tell people is this, talk to other people in your life, your pastor, your friends, people who are wise, spiritually wise and morally have a lot of wisdom, and ask them what they think you should do. If it may be the case that you need to hold your tongue in a particular situation, but if you have to do it once, you had better have an exit strategy because you know what's going to happen again and again and again. Back when I lived in New York 20 years ago, I had a friend, a traditionalist Catholic, who worked for a major investment bank. He was a manager, and his career was just going straight up. He knew, though, that the day was probably going to come with him when they asked him, why aren't you signing on to wear the Pride banner? He had been able just to keep his mouth shut for a while, but he knew that this was not going to last forever. He had gay people who worked for him. He said they're great workers. I don't bring my religion into the workplace, but I don't think human resources is going to let me continue. So what he did, he went out and got a real estate license so that if he ever got to a point where he would have to, as a matter of principle, resign from that bank, he would have a way to support his family. I think it is incumbent on every conservative, religious or not, who opposes wokeness to try to come up with an alternative plan to support your family. I think it's also important for those of us whose jobs are safer to start doing what we can to build these networks to where it will be easier for people to take the tough stands because they know that they won't be left alone economically and otherwise. But, I recall, Johnny, in the book I write about this, sitting with this Orthodox priest in Russia, Father Kirill Kaleda, in his church, which is right next to the National Monument for Victims of Political Violence south of Moscow. 21,000 people were murdered there in a 14-month period by the KGB in the 1930s during the Stalinist terror. Father Kirill told me, he goes, we as Christians are not called on to seek out suffering. So you don't need to seek out martyrdom. Don't martyr yourself at your job or whatever. But if it comes, you have to accept it with courage and with equanimity. I think that we need to be wise about this. You don't have to take a stand at each little turn, but eventually when you see the way the winds are blowing in your institution, you're going to have to be honest with yourself. Finally, let me say that a Catholic priest told me that he's an older man. He said, I've seen how this works in the Catholic Church. You're in the seminary and you see something wrong and you say, I'm going to hold my tongue until ordination. Then you get ordained. You see something wrong. You say, well, I'm going to wait till I'm a Monsignor. Then I'll speak out. You get to be a Monsignor. And this goes on and on. Well, when I'm a bishop, then I'll change things. By the time you make it into the Episcopal class, you've already assimilated the values of the system and you never speak up. I think that dynamic is something that we need to be quite aware of as we face these challenges ourselves in our own institutions. Finally, the example, I've written about this on my blog a lot, and it's also in Live Not by Lies, Havel's greengrocer. Václav Havel, the Czech playwright and dissident, came up with the example, a fictional example of a greengrocer under communism who is asked, as all the other small businessmen are, to hang a sign in the window that says, "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. None of them believe it, but they put it there in the window to go along to get along, to signal to the world that we're tame. We're not going to cause you any trouble. Well, what happens, says Havel, if the greengrocer decides, I'm sick of living by this lie. I'm not going to put this in my window. Well, he loses his job. He loses his business. His kids may lose college and so on and so forth. But by choosing to suffer for the truth, he sent a signal to everyone else who's watching that it is possible to live in truth if you're willing to suffer for it. And by so doing, he undermines the regime that demands everybody conform by making them afraid to suffer. Now, I think that we're all called at some point, we're all going to have to be Havel's greengrocer. I don't know what that looks like for me because, again, my job is safe. I work for the American Conservative. I write books. But I also know that if for some reason TAC were to go away, I'm completely unemployable in any mainstream media organization, even though I've written 3 New York Times bestselling books and I've established a long track record of being a good writer. So I can't ever allow myself to think that I'm safe. None of us ultimately are safe. But what I want to do is use the liberty and the privileges that I've been given to help build a world where I am safer, my kids are safer, and everybody who is a dissenter is safer to speak their minds.
One question we're getting a lot in the Q&A is sort of to sum up a couple of them is how do we engage folks who are sort of fully woke and try to persuade them that we're not the crazy ones, right? That we're not a threat to their existence. How do we try to, step into that conversation?
Yeah, I don't think there's a conversation to be had, to be honest. I mean, I've tried to have it myself. You're dealing with religious fanatics here. One of the most interesting aspects of the research I did for Live Not by Lies came in reading about the Bolshevik movement, how they came to power in Russia. There's a great book called The House of Government that came out in 2017 by Yuri Slezkin. He's a Russian-American historian who wrote about the Bolshevik Revolution. And he describes the Bolsheviks as a secular political millennialist cult. If you read about Bolshevik the way that Bolsheviks thought of themselves and thought of history, it's remarkable. They were very apocalyptic and they could not be reasoned with because you either believed it or you didn't. And if you didn't believe it, then you were the enemy. It's very, very close to what the way the woke see things. And it's this constant drive for purity, for ideological purity among them. I don't think they can be engaged. I think they can only be resisted. And I hate that because it seems hopeless and it's not part of our tradition. But if people do not believe that there's any such thing as truth, if for them, truth is only truth is in quotation marks, and it's only a manifestation of power, then all you could do is resist them. The thing that I fear, and this is something that I've learned from studying the dissident movement, is the dissidents they wanted to resist communism and resist totalitarianism, but they did not want to let anger and hatred conquer them. In reading the testimonies of Christians who went into prison, they prayed for their persecutors as Christ taught, but they also knew that if they gave their hearts over to hatred, that the enemy would have won. This is the thing that I struggle with myself. When I am attacked online, fortunately, it's only been on live because I live at home. I live in a very red city, but I try not to give in to hatred. But at the same time, I don't even try to reason with these people anymore. What I try to do is find those on the left who can be reasoned with, who know that there's something wrong with this. Maybe they really do care about racial justice. We should all care about racial justice. But they think that the only option is you can either be woke or you can be like some far right person who believes in racist things that they reject. What I try to do is to be to be conservative, but also to be sensible and to let them know that, you know what, I care about this too. I come at it from a different way, but I'm not indifferent to racial justice or these other problems that you've identified. But I think there's a better way to understand it and a better way to talk about it. I think that we have to try to get sensible, honest liberals, people who may be on the left, but who believe in liberal principles of open-mindedness and of a free exchange of ideas.
Rod, switching gears a little bit, I've seen a question brought up a few times in the chat about church and state relations and the proper role of Christians in the political life. I think if you think historically, a lot of people think back to the 1980s, and there's the religious right typically is associated with people like Jerry Falwell, sort of a evangelical or fundamentalist Protestant sort of movement. I know there was some unity with Catholics around issues like abortion and things like that. But more recently, we've seen sort of a small but vocal minority of people, particularly on Twitter, calling for a type of integralism or post-liberalism, where they envision sort of a different role where the state is, if not equal, then perhaps even subordinate to the church, or at least the ideals of the church. What do you make of this? I know you've at times on your blog, you've proposed a different path or rejected it. What should a proper relationship between the church and state look like? And what do you make of this project?
Well, yeah, no, thank you for the question. I mean, it's something that that does have a lot of prominence of the very online Christian right, of whom I'm a member. But I think integralism is just bonkers in this time and place. I mean, look, you can't even get a majority of Catholics to follow their own church's teaching on their own. How in the world are you going to get the state involved to try to enforce Catholic teaching? Besides, this is not even a majority Catholic country. This integralism is coming from Catholics, but we are a majority non-Catholic country, and increasingly, certainly with the younger generation, we're an increasingly secular country. So even if integralism was a good idea, it is a complete non-starter in America. I find myself sympathetic. My heart is sympathetic to some of what they advocate, but realistically, we have to realize that, as I've said, Christianity is in decline in this country. I wish it weren't so, and maybe we can work to make it differently, but it is in decline. I think that the best thing that we can do as Christians and as conservatives is fight for the First Amendment and freedom of religion. If we were not a pluralistic country, I would feel differently. But even Poland, which is ethnically homogeneous, which is religiously monolithic, everybody's Catholic there, they have as close as we're going to get to an integralist government and a social situation right now with the Law and Justice Party, and it is in real trouble. We've seen protests in Poland over the last 2 or 3 weeks, huge protests in the city streets. People feel that the Catholic Church has been too involved in political life. I'm not Polish. I can't take a position on whether they're right or they're wrong, but it has been an amazing thing to see, and a really worrying thing for somebody like me, who was raised in the John Paul II era, who always thought of Poland as this bastion, this fortress of Christianity in an increasingly godless continent. When I was there, Johnny, last year, and you're of Polish heritage, I believe. When I was there in Poland last year, I talked to young Catholics, practicing Catholics, conservative Catholics, who told me, yeah, in 10, maybe 20 years, this country is going to go the way of Ireland, when the church is going to collapse. I found that so impossible to wrap my head around. But I talked to an older Benedictine monk, a well-respected man, who said, it's happening here because the church is very, very thin. And now since that conversation a year ago, we've seen the first cracking of the connection between church and state there, which was never formal, but it was de facto, because people are just losing their faith. I think that it's just hopeless for American Christians, Catholic or otherwise, to place too much hope in Christianizing the political order. This is not to give up on being politically active. We have to be politically active, if only to protect our liberties. But it is to say that I really believe that it's folly to place so much passion in the idea of Christianizing the political order at this stage.
Thank you for that, Mr. Dreher. I think we can take about one more question here from the chat. So specifically, we have sort of people asking about, if don't we sort of need to, if I'll read this specific question here. It seems, she's saying it seems short-sighted to emphasize culture over politics if our sort of politics is going to suffocate our culture. Shouldn't we be more sort of more bullish on that? Sort of in reference to some of your earlier comments about activism versus ideas.
Right. Yeah. Well, I really do believe that the old saying that politics is downstream from culture. I would hope that my children would be conservatives, but I'm really 1,000 million times more concerned that they be faithful Christians. And I think that one big problem of my generation and the boomer generation on the Christian right is that we placed far too much hope in politics. What does it profit a man to gain the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court, but to lose his soul? I'm serious though. It's and it's not an either or. Again, I encourage people to be involved in politics, but I have had so many conversations with conservatives of my age and older who voted correctly and were always had their voter guide and always supported the Republicans for pro-life reasons and so forth, and yet their children have been lost to the faith. I think that some people are saying that they've left the faith, some young people, because of Trump, especially among evangelicals. I don't really buy that, but I do think that there's something to it, that by turning church into the Republican Party or MAGA at prayer, it's really turned a lot of people off. And I'm also seeing this, to be honest, among some people who have left their churches, their progressive churches, because they didn't go there to get a political sermon, and they don't associate social justice is important, but it's not the same thing or a substitute for Christianity. So I do believe that we have to get our priorities straight. In the Benedict option, I wrote about a really great essay that's on firstthings.com. It came out in 2004 by Robert Louis Wilken, the church historian, called The Church as Culture. And in it, again, this is 2004, Professor Wilken, who's a church historian, talked about there's nothing more important for the church today than to remind itself who it is, because this memory has gone so thin. And in a similar way, as we were talking earlier about what Václav Benda and the Czech dissidents did of getting seminars of people together just to talk about the things that make up our cultural memory, our literature, our history, our art, and our religion, Christians need to do the same thing, not instead of political activism, but before we get out into the public square to be political activists.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Rod, for joining us tonight. I think that wraps up our time here together. But I would encourage everyone listening and watching online to purchase the book, Live Not by Lies, help ensure that it stays on the New York Times bestseller list. Beautiful cover there. Yeah. And if you like the conversation that you heard tonight, I encourage you to go to isi.org and click on the resources tab, where you can see the other lectures, debates, and other conservative conversations with ISI that we've hosted throughout the years, and especially more recently. So thanks again for tuning in, and I hope to hear from you all soon.
Thank you for having me tonight. Thanks, everybody, for watching. It was great to be here. And again, I just want to say that one of the things I love about ISI is it's a different world from mere political activism. It lets you know what our political activism is for. It's about our traditions. It's about the life of the mind. And if conservatism only becomes about power, then what is it actually conserving? So thank you, ISI, for doing what you do.
Thanks so much, Rod.
Thank you.